community setting and best ways to stand up to it and combat it. Today we have as guests Rothstein, who is the founder and CEO of Stand With Us. And we have Rob Jacobs, who is the director of Stand With Us Northwest in Seattle. And coming back into the room, I hope, will be Barbara Mazur, who is in Brooklyn, New York, and helped organize and lead the successful effort to stop the Israel boycott movement at her food co-op, the Park Slope Food Co-op. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. We talked last week a little bit about BDS, and we're not going to have as extensive a discussion about what it's really about. I'm going to have Roz talk about that for a few minutes to set the table for the rest of it. But before I have the speakers introduce themselves a little bit more, the thought came to me, and Rob brought this up, specifically, I think, as we were preparing for this, that we're seeing something now. What you see is you can be walking down a street in a nice community, and in front of a store, you see people. They're angry-looking people. They're holding signs. They're holding banners. They're carrying flags. And in some cases, they're deliberately obstructing people's attempts to get into the store. In other cases, they're going into a store. They're vandalizing products. They're disrupting the businesses. And why are they doing this? They're doing this because the store is owned by the wrong people, or because it's selling the wrong products. And we thought that we had left this behind about 70 years ago. And we've seen this movie before. We've seen it in Europe. And now we're seeing it in the U.S., we're seeing it in Canada, we're seeing it in the U.K. And I think that illustrates, in large part, the heart of the BDS movement. It's a movement that essentially is built on lies, which we'll talk about, and it's enabled by ignorance and naivete. So part of what we're going to be doing here is to challenge a lot of the basis of BDS and talk about the lies on which it's built. Rob, do you want to go ahead and say a few words and introduce yourself and your expertise in this area?
Sure. My name is Rob Jacobs, and I'm the regional director in the Pacific Northwest for Stand With Us. And started with Stand With Us about now almost 7 years ago. And because what we were seeing in the community here was a growing activism on the part of anti-Israel activists, not pro-Palestinian, because there's no concern for any of the other Palestinians in other countries. It's only in relation to Israel. But it was becoming almost vicious. It was the misrepresentations were so over the top that when I first started hearing some of these, I thought, well, this is ridiculous. We don't need to deal with this because nobody will believe it. But I think the saddest part is that we've seen that the phrase that came out of Lenin or Goebbels.
Okay, there I am. Okay, great.
Okay, great. Welcome back. That Lenin or Goebbels, that you tell the big lie often enough, it becomes somebody's truth. Over the last 7 years, we've seen an increasing acceptance and incorporation of some of these horrific misrepresentations of Israel. And so we worked with a number of the activists that had been working for many years. Some of them are on the list of yours right now, to put together the Stand With Us regional office here and to start dealing with all sorts of issues. We seem to be an incubator in the Northwest for much of really negative anti-Israel pushes. For example, the boycott efforts at co-ops. After Davis, California, we were the next ones, and we had 4 in a row that were attempted here, where they tried to get the co-ops to boycott all Israeli products. They failed at 3, but were successful at the only place in the United States where they've succeeded to do a boycott, the Olympia Food Co. And bus ads came, then billboards. We were the first major city, the second city in the country, but the first major city to have to deal with a campaign, to have the city divest from investments in its employee retirement funds with companies doing business with Israel. That failed, but it was a real battle with the entire community pulled in. And then we have ongoing, regular, every year, 60, 70, 80 high schools that we know about at various times that have had anti-Israel speakers that come in and give presentations, and I'm not exaggerating. There are a series of dead baby pictures. The appeal is emotional. It's not intellectual. History and details are fudged, or pieces of them are ignored. And it's unfortunately very effective. I don't know, at this point, Michael, how far you want me to go into the things I was going to talk about, or you want to give everybody time to introduce themselves?
Yeah, let's go ahead and move around a little bit. And actually, I did want to point out a couple of things in the room for those of you who are participating and weren't here last week.
Michael's audio.
Can you hear me?
I lost everybody's audio.
Log out and come back in, Barbara. The chat room at the bottom, any of our viewers, please feel free to post questions in the chat box. I'm seeing some really good questions coming up.
And re-enter.
Yeah.
Hey.
Questions that we will get to in the discussion section after we've done a little presentation here, but I'm seeing some really good questions coming up, so please continue to post them there. I'll be watching that. We have Facebook and Twitter icons right up next to the speakers and viewers in the top right, and please feel free to go ahead and share this with your friends if they'd like to come on and listen. And then there's a small donations box in the top right. So if you what Stand With Us is doing, you can go ahead and make a secure online donation just by clicking on that donate button. Since Barbara's having some technical issues at this point, Roz, I'm going to go ahead.
Uh-oh.
You just froze, Michael.
Hard to keep it brief, giving your extensive account. But then just, talk briefly about BDS itself and what its actual goals are.
Okay, hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Michael, for hosting. Right now, you're a picture of a microphone, but I hope you can hear us. So the scenario that Michael gave us before was pretty much, we've seen it time and again. People who look pretty far radical will gather in front of a store and hope to get a lot of attention about boycotting a product. And they'll hand out leaflets about why Israel is so terribly bad. And, you really have to ask yourself, is this about peace or is this about something else? I want to tell everybody that when you have a chance, of course, after the show, because the show is going to be so interesting once we get everybody's heads back on. Hey, there's Mike.
I'm back.
That you take a look at a film that we made at the beginning of this whole mess called Say No to BDS. You can just type in YouTube, Stand With Us, Say No to BDS. And there, in that film, you can see at the core why this is such a disingenuous movement. They do not want the state of Israel to exist. The whole issue is to create ill will, to throw accusations and untruths about Israel on a regular basis, and then hope that some of it sticks to the wall. Like if you Google apartheid, you'll see so many different entries about Israel instead of South Africa. It's kind of ridiculous. So the idea is to smear Israel's name and then call for punishment. And this is, the boycott is not anything new. We saw that when the state of Israel became a state, was reborn in 1948. And you saw all the Arab countries, call for boycott and refuse to normalize relations with their new neighbor, their new Jewish neighbor. Because no matter how small Israel is, you cannot have a Jewish neighbor in the Middle East. So, and that is the theme that we're looking at today in the peace talks. You can't have a Jewish neighbor in the Middle East. It can be called something else, and you can call it what you will, temporarily, and then hopefully, according to the BDS promoters, it will be gone. But Michael, you reminded me of the incident not too long ago here where we had a group of people boycotting a store because it sold Ahava products. And what was interesting is we found out about it quite by accident. We got a note from someone and then someone. And we gathered a group of about 15 people quite spontaneously. And we also called the police because these guys intend to go into the store, label the product with some sticky thing to ruin the product, which is illegal.
What?
You cannot go in and ruin a product that belongs to someone else and they're trying to sell legally. So they were intending to come in and label these things and ruin them and make their points, of course, because they're so excited. Anyway, so the point is that we called the police. It was very helpful because then we called the store. We alerted the store. They had no idea this was coming. So, as we get into the conversation about what you can do in your community, first, I would never, laugh this thing off. I would take it seriously because they're going to do bad things. I would make sure that the police is alerted and the store. And then I would, post a challenging group of people, much the same as Mike Harris has been doing since the beginning, since he and I met, and we combined efforts to create a Stand With Us San Francisco Voice for Israel, which a lot is about countering nonsense and lies about the state of Israel. Making sure that other voice is there because otherwise people are misinformed. So, this is nothing new. I want to make that point. The boycott of Israel is nothing new. It goes way back to the Arab boycott of the state of Israel from its inception in 1948. We should say rebirth. But it also, lets us know that this is a disingenuous effort for the purpose of destroying Israel's reputation, future support, and ultimately the state of Israel altogether. Mike, can you hear me?
Sure, thank you. And absolutely. And let's be very clear about this. The BDS movement itself, and if any of you who are viewers are not familiar with the actual document called the BDS Call, you really need to go ahead and look at it because there are in it three demands. The first one says that Israel needs to withdraw from all Arab land, but they're not being really specific whether they consider, as many rejectionists do, Tel Aviv to be just as much occupied Arab land as a small hilltop settlement across the Green Line. The second demand they have is equality for the Arab citizens of Israel, but it's unclear what they mean by that, including whether they mean that they should have veto power over the Jewish majority, which is clearly an undemocratic demand. And the third one that really encapsulates their determination to eliminate Israel as the state of the Jewish people is the endorsement of the fictional right of return and the demand that millions upon millions of descendants of refugees from the 1947-48 war, the Arab refugees, that Israel be required to take them in and make them citizens, which, of course, if you do the math, turns Israel from the state of the Jewish people into a binational state. And we've seen how well this has worked out in places such as Bosnia and Iraq and Lebanon and Sudan, and now being once again shown how well this works out in a place like Ukraine. So that's really the core of what BDS is about, and that's why we are putting all the effort into fighting it. Barbara, I want to turn this to you at this point. I don't see you on my screen, but there we go. I can hear you perfectly well. So if you can talk about what happened at the Park Slope Food Co-op, introduce yourself a little bit, and tell the story in about 10 minutes of what happened there. And, the most important things are lessons people can learn about how to successfully organize against BDS.
Okay, thank you, Mike. All right, so like Barbara, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm a member of a food co-op that has about 16,000 members. And it's a store that's member only. You have to contribute labor, which is part of why its costs are so low. And they also publish an internal newspaper every 2 weeks, which is an important part of our story. So back in 2010, there's a club in Brooklyn called Brooklyn for Peace, and a number of those members are also food co-op members. And they began to submit letters defaming Israel and suggesting that the co-op join the BDS movement. And several of us started to write letters back in the newspaper. And eventually we realized that they were going to submit some kind of motion to be approved for us joining the BDS movement. So we felt that we had to start to organize and be ready to mobilize and get people to a meeting, a general meeting, when this thing would come for a vote. So even though, things were announced, so couldn't happen in secret like it happened in Olympia, we still, not too many people pay attention to what's going on at their grocery store for their politics. So we started to put in letters, and we got people to sign up, and we reached out to synagogues. At that time, I contacted Rob and StandWithUs and Avi Posnick in New York to get ideas on how to present our counter arguments, how to organize people. They have experience with the co-ops out on the West Coast already. And eventually we got the JCRC involved, and they helped in our efforts to publicize and mobilize that this was coming. And since so many journalists seem to live in Park Slope, it became a very big news story. It went national. It was picked up in Israel. And almost 2 years ago exactly, we had the vote where about 1,400 people showed up, which is about 7 times a normal general meeting. And we turned it down by 60 to 40. And that was what we did. And we focused our messaging on that this was just bad for the co-op, that it was, that was unfair to impose a particular political solution upon us, but also that the movement is just not helpful for peace at all, that it really works against peace, that it works to further divisions between Arabs and Jews in Israel, and that this was just not a healthy place for people to be going.
Great. Barbara, one of the things that's been a question always in combating BDS efforts, and I'd certainly like, your impressions, and Rob also, based on the work that you've been doing, fighting similar efforts up in the Seattle area, and please feel free to go into detail on that. There's 2 different strategies to combat the BDS efforts, one of which is to try to directly address the lies that they put out. And, we've seen certainly from the discussions on campuses, not only just like Israel's an apartheid state, but all sorts of ridiculous allegations of Israel deliberately poisoning water supplies and shutting off water to Arab communities, all sorts of ludicrous things. Is it better to confront these lies head on, or is it better to deal with the emotional appeal and look just the sort of the overarching sentiment in terms of the issues? What have you found? And then Rob, I'd like to hear your answer to that as well.
I think you have to work with a combination of approaches. I mean, some people will, be moved by, saying, don't do this to our community, give us our privacy. But you have to realize that the people who have joined on to us feel absolutely righteous in their approach. They've bought into this idea of Israel as guilty of these horrible crimes. So you do have to show that it's untrue, but what you also have to show is that their approach is hypocritical and that their approach undermines the values that they believe they hold true, and that they're coming to this point from believing lies, and that they're coming to this point from bigotry. And people don't like to hear that, but you have to be able to turn that around on them. One of the things that happened during our BDS battle, the BDS group had these presentations, so I attended one, and they were talking about Israel's separation barrier, but kept calling it the apartheid wall. So I mentioned the number of suicide attacks that had come before the wall was quilt during the Second Intifada. And one of the people in the audience says, "But the Palestinians have no choice." And not a single person protested this point of view, which was shocking to me, because here you have these people who believe they are so supportive of human rights. What they're doing is for the sake of human rights. And to them, well, attacking Israeli civilians was perfectly okay because they've been so dehumanized in their minds. But also, the Palestinians were just not subject to the same human rights expectations that the rest of the world are expected of. And third, it was just an ignoring of 20 years of peace process that was going on. So to say they have no choice was just to infantilize the Arabs. So it's really very much they're coming from a place of othering, and they're coming from a place of privilege.
So let me jump in, and I think the theme to me that I have seen throughout the last 7 years working on these issues is that there's a constant battle between people who feel like it is beneath us to respond directly to each allegation and complaint, or that it is divisive for us to get involved, but they forget that there's somebody else who already started the argument. And there's, especially within the Jewish community, this sense that nobody is going to believe this anyway. If we respond to it, it's just going to bring attention to the things that they're saying. So we should just let it go because it'll die out on its own. And one, I think it's self-evident it hasn't died out on its own. But second is that, sadly, and we've seen this from political campaign after political campaign, negative ads work. And the negative ads work, especially if the other side doesn't respond to them, because an allegation that's been made without a response is seen by many people, because there's no response, as an acceptance that it's true. And so we have tried as frequently as possible in the appropriate forums to respond. Now, if you go to a boycott, divestment, sanctions organizational meeting, or to many, unfortunately, of the mainline churches that have an active anti-Israel element, you're not going to move people. They've already bought in. They've drank the Kool-Aid. You might change one or two minds of new people that are there, but you don't really have a chance, especially when there's a speaker or there's an agenda, to jump in and make your opinion known, except for the first comment they'll make. They won't call you on you again after that. But I think in any place where you have people coming who don't already know the facts and who are open to hearing a position, if you don't respond to the over-the-top anti-Israel propaganda, it's accepted and it's believed. And I think that's also true when you talk about it in the more public forum, and increasingly within our own Jewish community at times you see it. And if you don't respond to it, more and more people are buying into it. On the college campuses, this is why so many of the young students believe that they're doing something righteous, that they are out there saving the world. Because they hear one side, they see an emotional appeal, people respond really well to images. Unfortunately, those images have no context. You don't know where the picture was taken, and often it's not related to Israel at all, but it moves people and they're being used. And I think it's essential that there is a counter to it in any place where people are willing to entertain both sides of the information. The other thing that I found is that we have a real difficulty in our position of responding, reacting to the negative, because we'd rather be proactive, but that is not the kind of energy that everybody in the community jumps onto. They don't necessarily, if you're showing a film that's positive about Israel, for example, if somebody's got free time and they have nothing else to do, they may come. On the other hand, the folks that are showing the negative films about Israel that portray it as a horrific country get a big turnout because people are coming to save the world. And so it's a different motivation, and they'll show up and they'll become more involved. You have a number of problems. One, it's, as I said, it's an emotional propaganda. People no longer doubt what they see on the web or in blogs. But if something's printed in nice fonts and looks like it's legitimate journalism, people will read it and accept it, even if it's completely off base and has no factual underpinning. But the other piece is that we're playing a game that I call whack-a-mole. And many of you may remember the game where you turned it on as a little kid, and then the little disc went around on it, and every once in a while through the disc, the little head of a mole popped up, and you took a hammer and hit it down. And the idea was you never knew where it was going to come from next. And that's the advantage the BDS movement has. They're able to sit there and prepare in quiet, to put out their propaganda, to get involved, and this was the strategy, get involved with the co-op, for example, become members, and get involved in the food committee or one of the committees in the co-op, and be working on issues like plastics or whether we do recycling or whatever we do in the co-op. But then along the way, once you've built the trust, start introducing really negative anti-Israel types of things and saying we have a moral responsibility as a progressive co-op to take our commercial action here to save the people of Palestine. And that's the phrase that's used in the presentation. And they build support by putting out this propaganda when there's nobody knowing that it's happening outside of the co-op and where we don't know to respond. And then all of a sudden, somebody will introduce a resolution to boycott Israeli goods or a resolution to divest from Israel at a campus. And what we have to do, and what it's very difficult to do, is to have ears on the ground, to reach out and know when this is happening so that we can prepare ahead of time. Otherwise, we are always in a reactive state where we are rushing quickly. And we have been effective, but it is difficult to change people's belief systems once they're already established. But you come in, as Barbara was saying, with information, trying to point out the hypocrisy, trying to point out the inconsistencies, trying to undercut something really dramatic that they've made as a factual argument so that people have some doubt about the rest of what they're hearing. But it's very difficult.
Absolutely, Rob, and I think that was a very, very nice summary, describing the problem and the issue. And I think, what you've seen also, and it's been seen in other areas of the country, when you look at organizations, that have membership, say, food co-ops, unions, what have you, a lot of times these anti-Israel resolutions, these actions are brought up and railroaded through specifically in violation of the organization's own.
Michael, we just
minute they're done without going through the proper vetting procedures.
Right. I mean, we saw that the one location that has passed a boycott, a commercial boycott of Israeli goods, the Olympia Food Co-op, small 2-store co-op in Olympia. The only way it passed was because they were presenting material for a while. The board members, they had some board members on some members on the board that were members of the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign. And then when they introduced the resolution, they brought 40 or so people to the board meeting. It was not on the agenda. They insisted, because it was a dire, situation, and that Palestinians were dying and somebody needed to act now, they insisted that the co-op vote that evening on it, even though some of the board members were saying, shouldn't we talk to our staff? It was part of the procedural requirement that they go through. And the reason they went to the board itself is because they've been trying to get it to the staff, and the staff would not agree to it. But in any case, they then brought it to the board, bypassed the procedures and the rules that the co-op had, and were successful at getting the board to vote for it. It was trumpeted the next day as some dramatic success, that you had a co-op in Olympia, Washington, vote to boycott Israeli products. But the problem with it was that they violated rules of the co-op in order to be able to pass that. And there are a number of members of the co-op that were very upset, that had been long-time members. This was their community. Forget a synagogue, forget anything else. The community was the co-op. They've been members for 25 years, some of them, and had been, in fact, president of the co-op in the past. And they were so upset with the fact that the rules had been bypassed that they wanted to go back and have the co-op board take the vote again, but go through the proper procedures, do what it was supposed to do, get the consensus of the staff members. The board never did that, and ultimately it's led to a lawsuit that's still pending, where what the plaintiffs, the co-op, longtime co-op members are looking for is for the board to do a better job of representing the co-op members by following the procedure itself. And that's the biggest thing, and I'll just close with this. The biggest thing that I've seen is that the folks that are active and organizers for boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the ends justify the means. Their whole process is to win. They play hardball politics. It's like machine city politics, Chicago politics of the old days, where whatever you need to do to win, you do it, and then you declare victory afterwards. And we have so many people who firmly oppose what they're doing, but at the same time want to play by the rules, want to do everything by giving notice. And the problem with it is, unfortunately, that hardball politics often wins, which is why it was done for so many years in machine politics cities.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. And I think you absolutely, once again, described accurately what we see, not only in the community, but as we talk. The Olympia Food Co-op in the wake of the BDS effort there. This is also something we see repeated across the country on campuses, in organizations in the community, that BDS, because of its very nature, because of the fact that it's a hypocritical, biased movement, and because of the fact that it often will violate an organization's own rules, it leaves a great deal of dissension and rancor in its wake. But it doesn't care. The BDS circus picks up its tent and moves on to the next town. There's a wonderful blog. I'm going to put the URL up here. It's in the chat box, called Divest This. And the person who blogs there does a phenomenal job of really chronicling this in great detail, and I think it's a tremendous resource for looking into essentially, theory and practice of BDS. How does it really manifest itself? And using the lessons, for example, what happened at Olympia and other organizations, and even I'm sure at Park Slope, to show other organizations, this is what happens when you open the door and let the vampire in. When you let BDS into your organization, this is going to be the end result, because BDS doesn't really give a damn about your organization. It just wants to be able to tack your organization's name on the wall of, this is another group that supports BDS. Barbara, you also had a great line that you had shared with me about context, which I think is a wonderful line to illustrate the importance of context, if you want to share that with everybody.
Oh, okay. I mentioned that if I told you a story of masked men breaking into a home and murdering the resident in front of his family and stealing all his electronic equipment, you would be quite horrified on behalf of that man. If I then told you I was describing the taking out of Osama bin Laden, you would feel differently about that story.
Right, and I think that's just a wonderful little vignette that you can really tell people, why the importance of context, and why when BDS deliberately takes things out of context and turns everything against Israel, when there are indeed two parties to this conflict that are both active, involved, and taking steps, that's really the only way to look at that. So let's move the discussion. Now we've sort of defined the problem, and we've talked about, especially
Mike.
Yeah, go ahead, Roz.
I wanted to add something to
Please.
what Rob was talking about, and
Sure.
I'm watching all these questions coming up. I'm trying to engage.
Sure.
This is a very interesting process, being with you guys and watching the questions that are coming up. So one of the questions we see is how you go from responding to being proactive. And that's a lot of what we do. That is a lot of what we do. So in other words, not just keeping an eye on all of the full variety of attacks that come towards us, but also making sure that we're out there educating and letting people know through films, through speakers, through materials, making sure we're pushing out information that's good and letting students know more about the state of Israel, having them be proud and having them be inspired, and so that they can inspire others. So that's all proactive, and that's all very important. And I encourage everybody to take a look at our materials at Stand With Us and learn more just generally, just so you can have a better, richer conversation to begin with. That's being proactive, informing yourself so that you can participate and you can inform others and inspire others with the great things that Israel does. So I wanted to say that. The other thing is, I think we learn a lot from the strategy of those who promote BDS and those who lead BDS. If you read their strategy, you see that they really, one of their goals is to create chaos. And that is what you see. It's not necessarily to win by any means. It's to smear. It's to bring information that is completely twisted. It is to focus on one side of the story. It's to lie. It's to lie, as they did as Omar Barghouti lied the last time he spoke at UCLA. It's lies, for example, that the Israelis, for sport, will kill Palestinian children. Almost like people hunters shoot ducks. The Israeli soldiers are in the business of, arbitrarily shooting anybody. So, this goes back to, effective blood libel that we've seen centuries ago, and that really, can make people confused and hate. And so, we're looking at a lot of hate speech, a lot of chaos created by the movement. And then it's really important to take a look at the core of why. Where is this all coming from? What is the ultimate goal? And once again, I want to, for those who didn't hear this, take a look at the film Say No to BDS. You will find it if you go to YouTube and put in Stand With Us, Say No to BDS. It's a great little film. It's short, and it shows you how disingenuous they really are.
Yeah, I put the URL on that in the chat room before, and I'm going to go ahead and drop it down there again. And Roz, that's exactly what we were going to get to in terms of things that you can do proactively and try to avoid what Rob accurately described as the whack-a-mole phenomenon. And that's a longer effort. I mean, that's really a marathon. It's not a sprint. And that's the effort that you've been involved with for almost 15 years at this point, trying to work on proactive education about Israel. And so I want to talk a little bit about other specific strategies that we can use in response. And then we've had some excellent questions from those who are in the room that have been put in the chat room, and I do want to get to those as well. But I want to describe a little event that we did here in San Francisco, which is somewhat applicable to other communities. There was a small community store located in San Francisco, sold housewares, been community store for about 75 years in a neighborhood, family-owned store. And they were being relentlessly hassled by local BDSers to the point that these folks would come into this relatively small store, block the aisles, be singing their little BDS chanty songs. They were so proud of themselves, they'd film themselves and put them up on YouTube for it. And they were disrupting the operations of the store. Why? Because the store dared to defy them and carry SodaStream products. So what we did was organize a quiet little counter effort. We did this without public notice. We didn't put this up on our Facebook page. We just privately contacted about 24 people who we knew were reliable. And one Sunday morning, we had about 20 to 25 people lined up outside their store as it was opening. We were all carrying our Stand With Us by Israel Goods shopping bags. And we go into the store, and we simply buy a bunch of stuff, and we explained to the store staff that we were there because we knew that they had been targeted. Now, none of us lived anywhere near the store. None of us would be shopping there because it's not a neighborhood store for us. But people made the effort to come from across the Bay Area, and we bought stuff, and you should have seen the wonderful smiles and the friendly response from all the store staff. One of them was so excited about this, he actually asked us for one of the shopping bags, which we were happy to give to him. We found out that the BDSers later came back again, and we went back to the store again. And this store staff now understands the difference between people who come in and try to block their business, interfere with their livelihood, and people who are there just to support them against that. That's a strategy that can be done any place. Again, you don't want to announce it publicly and have the other side come out to create a big, huge incident when you're there. There's a group in the UK, Sussex Friends of Israel. There is a store there that has been the target of BDS movement for many, many weeks. These folks will come out and really hassle the store, hassle customers going into the store, and they show up. They are out there. They're there as well with flags, with pro-Israel signs, with information, and they've outnumbered and dismayed the BDSers, and they go and they buy products at the store, which of course ultimately is what the store is about. So these are local efforts, and of course, Roz, Stand With Us organizes the Buy Israel Goods Day, which is a much more macro scale way of defying the BDSers. And if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
The Buy Israeli Goods is a joint efforts between Stand With Us and the Israel America Chamber of Commerce. No, it's the America Israel Chamber of Commerce. And we have a website, and it's very helpful. But the main thing is that, you know, when we see that there are days of boycott called, which every once in a while, they stopped really doing this as much as they used to, where there's a day of boycott that they try to get everybody going across the country, across Canada, etc. We will typically immediately launch the counter, which is a very, very positive way to help Israel. Just go to your neighborhood store that sells Israeli products. Right before Passover, everybody can help. And if you take pictures of yourselves and buying Israeli goods in a market, you know, or in a shopping basket, and put your kids in it and just participate, it's lots of fun. And send us your pictures. We'll post them for you, and it can be very exciting.
Great, thank you. I want to get to some of the audience questions here. So Raphael asked, how can we best help counter misleading mass media BDS stories? And, you know, that's a very, very good point. There was actually in the New York Times earlier this week, there was a discussion that was printed between Dr. Daniel Gordis from Israel of Shalem College, phenomenal author and speaker, if any of you have ever had the pleasure of seeing him live, and Lara Friedman, who's the director of Americans for Peace Now, talking about whether a boycott specifically of goods produced across the Green Line will be good for Israel or not. And the New York Times itself, in the introduction, talked about the boycott movement as being something aimed at ending the occupation of the West Bank, and right, also talking about the fictional right of return as if it was fact. So, you know, this is the New York Times, the supposed paper of record, grossly misrepresenting what the aims of BDS actually are about. So, you know, mass media is a little bit different, and, you know, not something really that Stand With Us is as involved in as other groups such as Honest Reporting and Camera, the media watchdog groups. But, you know, this is critical, and a lot of this is really just educating the media properly as to what BDS is actually about. Barbara, in your dealings with media at Park Slope Food Co-op, did you see the same kind of misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the BDS movement?
Well, when I dealt with media, I would try to make sure to always say that the movement's intention was to end Israel as a state for the Jewish people. And I think that we really have to emphasize that that's their goal. That has always been the goal of Arabs in the area, that not to allow there to be Jewish residency, not there to be Jewish equal rights, and especially not there to be a Jewish state, and that they've tried all kinds of efforts, intimidation, warfare, and now this. And we also have to be able to stand up for the idea of the Jewish state as something that's good and something that's progressive and something that stands for human rights, that is not racist, that there's no contradiction between a state being, mainly of a major ethnicity, provided that it protects the rights of its minority populations, which Israel does. And that, anybody who's promoting getting rid of a Jewish state or thinks that there's a one-state solution where everybody living together beautifully, kumbaya, that this is a really regressive idea, and that it would be the equivalent of suggesting that we return to racial segregation or that we take away suffrage for women. That this is I think where our efforts have to be focused on, making BDS something that's outside the realm of polite conversation, because the moment that you start to say, well, this is a racist movement, the BDS people will say, oh, you're trying to censor us, or you're trying to deny my right to free speech. Well, we do have social standards of who we think are, acceptable speakers who we want to listen to. And we have to brand them as something that's outside the pale, that's not progressive, that doesn't promote peace, that promotes racism, that promotes... for example, if you wanted to do something like promote coexistence between Palestinians and Jews and maybe have a youth orchestra that would have Jewish and Arab children in it, Omar Barghouti would say, no, you shouldn't do that. We don't want to mix with them. We don't want to normalize. They are not worth normalizing with. They are not human. The dehumanization is not coming from the Jewish side. The dehumanization is coming from the Arab side. And this is BDS's goal, to dehumanize us. And we have to be clear about that this is not acceptable, that a Jewish state is something good, a Jewish state is something necessary, a Jewish state is something beneficial, and that their talk is outside the pale of acceptable discussion.
So let me jump in for a second here. Please. One of the things that, when you were talking about the media response, when you're talking about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, when you're talking about major newspapers, Los Angeles Times has a local component to it. But when you're talking about the papers that are considered, quote, quote, national papers, it becomes very difficult to have a local response to that. And that is why some of the large organizations have formed to respond to and educate and try to, demonstrate to the reporters, the editors, that their information is wrong, with this sort of hope that they're open to actually hearing a different perspective. But I think one of the things we found here in the Northwest is that we have a group of really dedicated letter writers, and we were able to organize, before Stand With Us even started, it existed, people who were writing to correct misinformation in the local newspapers. And what we did, it doesn't take a lot of people, but we had 7 people who each took a day. They would each get a copy of the newspaper. Now you can do it online. And they would find stories that looked like they were misrepresenting the facts or presenting Israel in a bad light unfairly. And they would circulate those to the rest of the listserv that we put together, the rest of the volunteers, with some potential speaking points. And they've done a tremendous job. We have hundreds and hundreds of letters to the editor, some op-eds that they put together. It's not necessarily branded as a Stand With Us in our case, because they're individuals, and in fact, the fact that it comes as individuals is much more powerful than if it was always coming from an organization. But what we've been able to do is to respond. Now, the real question is how effective and how meaningful is it now to get a letter into the letters to the editor? How many people are really looking at that? And now that it's online, how many people are digging through the hundreds of comments on articles, op-eds, that kind of thing? And that's a different issue. But in terms of responding, I think it's one of those great avenues where you can get people who are energized and want to be activists to do something. It's also really educational for many of them. Some of the folks that have been doing it for years have developed a really serious expertise in the history of Israel, the history of the conflict. It's a positive outlet for volunteers who really want to do something and feel like they're making a difference. And I think it does make a difference. There's a response, whereas if they weren't doing it, it would just be taken as fact.
That's wonderful. And again, this comes to the point that we can do things, we can organize, and we don't want to let the lies on which the BDS movement is built sit out there, because no response is looked at as, well, you didn't respond, you don't have a response.
Right.
There was a question.
Mike, may I just tell a very quick story?
Please do.
Everybody may not know about the Zim ship. There was a Zim ship that docked in Oakland, California, and was not unloaded for 24 hours, which prompted us to call the dock workers and find out if we can come and sit with them and talk with them, because it was actually very upsetting to so many people that this happened, that the Zim ship, an Israeli ship, was not unloaded. And there's more to that story, but just that's the most important point, which prompted us to go up there and speak to the dock workers. Once we got up there, we were promised 5 or 10 minutes. It was Dr. Roberta Seid, who's on our team, who went up there to speak, and she actually ended up speaking to them for over an hour. And the most important thing that came out of it, besides giving them some information that they did not have before, was that they told her that in the past there had been no presentations, never, not even one, from a group representing Israel's point of view, a moderate, sort of just a centrist Israel's point of view, and answering questions to these people. So, when we talk about being proactive and pushing out information like, a tidal wave, we've got to really make sure that we are really doing our job to make sure that people are educated before this drip of this effort to make sure that everybody is misinformed and creating this ill will against the state of Israel. We have to make sure we're doing our job and being proactive and getting a lot of information out there, because in this case, Roberta Seid was the first person who ever spoke to this group.
And apparently did so quite effectively. Raphael had also posted a question in the chat room asking if Stand With Us is only focusing on BDS, and the answer is no. But because Stand With Us deals with many different aspects of advocacy for Israel, but BDS is essentially the way in which the rejectionist movement against Israel expresses itself. Okay, so all of their activities really fall under that type of rubric. So if you're countering those who refuse to accept Israel as a Jewish state, then yeah, I mean, in a large extent, you are focusing on the BDS movement, because that's how all of these anti-Israel groups have organized themselves. And one thing it's really important to remember: the thing that BDS opposes most of all is any type of peace between a Jewish state of Israel and the Palestinians, even a future Arab state of Palestine. They oppose that most of all because their goal, as their BDS chief Omar Barghouti has said on at least one occasion, is not an Israel next to a Palestine, but a Palestine next to a Palestine. Norman had asked, how do you measure the strength of BDS, and does it matter? I'll start with an initial answer to that. I think one of the ways that you can measure the failures of BDS is you look at the incredible investments that are going on in Israel from companies around the world, especially American high-tech companies. All of us who are sitting here taking part in this discussion are using computers with equipment or software that was originally designed in Israel. All of us who use cell phones are doing the same. Apple has now opened an R&D center in Israel. The state of California just signed a massive cooperation with Israel in areas such as water, energy, cybersecurity. That's a California-sized BDS fail. And Israel's economy continues to go from strength to strength. So if you look at the actual practical effects of BDS, has it really affected Israel's economy? No, not really. Has there been a single university in this country that has agreed to divest investments from Israel? No. Has there been a single municipality that has voted to divest its own investments from Israel? No. So, we don't want to completely dismiss it as something that is completely ineffective, because it does try to reach people's hearts and minds with the lies that it puts out, and that's the reason to counteract it. But in terms of objective measurements of what has BDS actually accomplished, very, very little. Rob, Barbara, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, as well, that if you look back at what they continually say, the BDS campaign says that most of their quote successes have nothing to do with Israel, where a company will sell off shares of a stock that relate to of a company that does work in Israel. And BDS will claim a success at convincing the company to divest from Israel, and it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with an investment decision. But they'll grab onto that for the PR, which is, I think, at essence, a lot of what we're talking about. When the Olympia Food Co-op boycotted 5 or 6 products, because that's what they had on their shelves from Israel, it's not going to affect the economy of Israel directly. What they're hoping to do is a PR win. And each these efforts that they make, no matter how small and how meaningless they are, they turn into a PR victory. And if they can get it to look like there is a wave of companies, a wave of schools, a wave of people endorsing their BDS campaign, that's when it becomes dangerous. It's the idea that people start to believe that there is a quote movement. I don't use their language. I mean, they tried framing this as the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, as if there's this wave of people going this direction. I call it a campaign because it's basically a small number of activists that have energized groups within local communities. But even so, when they're in a local community, the number of people at any one of these co-ops, the Olympia Food Co-op has 15,000 members. There were a couple hundred people actively involved in it, on behalf of the BDS group. The Central Co-op in Seattle, that was the first one here to do it, has about 20-some thousand members. There were about 9-10 people that showed up at the committee meetings. And then when it got really hot, they got all the way up to 20 supporters. So this is not a movement. This is a campaign. And I think that part of it is the PR. It's really important to emphasize that they're not very successful. That doesn't mean that we don't fight it like crazy, because it will be successful if there's no response. But they claim a lot of successes. They've actually, because of that, had a few in California in the UC system this past year. But I think that the most important thing is to point out that anytime they come up with a claim of a success, we make sure people, the newspapers, the press, communities are aware that that's, in most cases, it wasn't a success. They didn't have anything to do with the decision that was made.
Great. And then again, as we pointed out, John Haber, who runs the absolutely awesome Divest This blog, really chronicles in great detail a lot of that. So those of you who aren't following his blog should really do that. It's a very, very useful source of information. Josh brought up an interesting point in the chat room that I think is worth addressing. And I think, in large part, this is something we're trying to do. He said that if on balance, it looks like you're supporting Palestinian and Israeli interests, then BDS loses credibility. And I think that's a good point. And I think that in large part with the advocacy that Stand With Us does, and by the way, I'll also mention again for those of you who are in the room, you can see up in the top right corner a little donations box. Thank you for whoever already made a small donation. Donating directly to Stand With Us and to the work that we do, both against BDS and as far as Israel education generally. Please be encouraged to click that small donate button and make a small donation online. But when and Barbara and Rob, since you've been on the ground specifically in these organizations as well, isn't it a fair statement that when our side is talking against BDS, we are talking about promoting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, where when BDS is talking, they are talking about eliminating Israel entirely. They're really not talking about ways to generate peace between a Jewish state of Israel and its neighbors.
More so, they never frame it as they're talking about eliminating Israel. In fact, they'll talk about how they care so much for the people of Israel. They just want peace for everybody. But, what they're asking for in terms of the right of return is the elimination of the state. I think, the interesting thing about this is that they are not talking about peace. Rarely you hear them talking about wanting to get to peace, but what they're really talking about is ostracizing, it's eliminating, it's denying discussion, it's eliminating communication. And we saw that up here in Seattle a couple of years ago when there was a group brought over by an organization called the Wider Bridge out of San Francisco that of LGBT leaders from Israel. They came over and they wanted to meet with LGBT leaders here. It was basically sharing best practices, whatever. And in the Seattle area, because they were Israelis. Now, these are people who organized the second or third largest gay and lesbian parade in the world in Tel Aviv. They had a planned meeting with the city commission in Seattle, the LGBT commission, and Jewish Voice for Peace and groups like them went into high gear and so defamed them, so defamed Israel, and went and talked to the commission apart from ahead of time and apart from any other input, and vilified Stand With Us because we're helping organize some of their meetings. That they beforehand, here you have an international delegation. The day beforehand, the commission disinvited them, which became a huge brouhaha here. But because you had the city council apologizing for it, they ended up needing more city council members than they would have otherwise. But the whole point was that they were thrilled. They said, finally, somebody's hearing our side, which is to deny the other people the opportunity to hear or be heard. And it's really an interesting, bizarre, we're promoting speech by denying anybody who supports Israel the right to speak. And you see that at the co-ops, you see it when you make allegations against them, you're trying to deny us the right to speak, yet they've got the floor. They're taking up most of the time, and they're claiming they're being denied the right to speak.
We just had an incident at Cal State Pomona where two Israeli soldiers were trying to present their point of view, just tell the story. They came from Israel, and they were willing to sit for hours and answer questions. And the truth is, the group showed up, the BDS kind of group, and they were shouting and didn't let these guys speak. There's your free speech for one side and not for the other, and it's so counterproductive. I mean, it sort of is symptomatic. If you take a look at that lack of dialogue, that lack of ability to just sit, listen, and then ask your questions respectfully. You're looking at what's going on. It's a microcosm of the Middle East. We should be able to have respectful conversations, and there should be a give and take, admission of fault when there's fault, offers made, compromise. But, if you can't talk or you can't listen, you'll have nothing, and a lot of nothing.
Yeah, and in the Orwellian BDS world, their efforts in academia, now the American Studies Association is trying to defend its voted boycott of Israeli institutions by saying that anybody who is condemning that is condemning their free speech and their academic freedom, which is essentially denying someone else their own free speech and academic freedom. So it's a very, very twisted Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass type of world. And next week, we are actually going to specifically address that issue in the third installment of this series, talking about countering BDS in academia. And we're going to have Dr. Roberta Seid, who is Stand With Us Director of Research, and as Roz pointed out, did a tremendously effective job educating the dock workers in Oakland. We're also going to have two other members of the academic community, Peggy Shapiro, who is the Stand With Us Community Coordinator in Chicago, and Sam Edelman, who now is working with the Israel on Campus Coalition. And we're going to be specifically addressing the efforts to promote BDS in the academic community and how to counter that. And since we've been going now for a little over an hour, I'd like each of the three of you to maybe go ahead and just make some closing statements. Anything else you'd like to add that we didn't get to? Rob, can we start with you? And then we'll go to Barbara and then Roz.
Sure. I think that the one takeaway that I've had from the years of experience doing this now is that the only way to effectively respond or counter the BDS campaign is to engage people who are as emotionally committed and are aware enough of how they come across on our side so that they can engage uncommitted people or people who are being barraged by the anti-Israel material and thoughts. But it's really, the other side is very committed. They, they're people who commit their entire life. It's amazing that they have nothing else that they need to do in life to focus on this campaign in small numbers. But that kind of commitment is powerful, and we need to be able to reach out and find more people who are willing to make a serious commitment of their own emotional energy to do this. And also to realize that you need to do it in a way that recognizes who you're talking to and how to talk to them and how to engage them without putting them off. And I think if we can do that, the facts are on our side, the reality is on our side, and we just need to get the message out.
Thank you. And then Barbara, anything you'd like to add for closing?
I would say that as a lay person involved in this, it's taken a lot of emotional energy. And I would say, Ross, you're going to love me, but if you really feel strongly about this, then you should be donating your money to organizations like Stand With Us and Honest Reporting in Camera so that they can hire the professionals to stand up for us and to get out the word in a professional manner, because we really need to renew our commitment to what Jewish self-determination in our ancestral homeland means. And we need to be able to sell that again to ourselves and to the world, that it's our right and it is right, and that these are people who are really out to hurt us.
All right, thanks. Roz, closing comments?
Well, I think it's important for all of us to be more informed. I think it's important for everybody to view themselves as an informer, a teacher, someone who can get out there and promote good information. So I'm very biased about that, and that's it goes back to the beginning of the organization and the priority that we have in making sure that people who love Israel but don't know why, who love Israel because it's emotional, need to sort of take a step back and learn more about really why it's so special, and help people. Right now is the time, because as everybody on this panel pointed out, the BDSers and all their friends are promoting misinformation because they do want to smear Israel. They want to jeopardize future support for the state of Israel, which is the goal. Please do get a chance and watch the film that we pointed out earlier, which is Say No to BDS. You'll find it on YouTube, Say No to BDS, and Michael gave you the link to it. What's important about it is it just completely, it's transparent. It shows you why these guys don't have a good goal for peace. Are they about peace and peaceful coexistence with the state of Israel? No, they're not. Just ask them. Ask Omar Barghouti, what is your final goal? What is the goal of BDS? You're the founder. Omar, what is your goal? Is it peace? Peace with Israel as your Jewish neighbor next door? And the answer is no. So, I encourage everybody to please go to Stand With Us. The resources are free. Sign up for the newsletter. Be part of our team because it's international now. We're pretty big. And we invite you to come along with us and push out good, solid information in a variety of ways, including videotapes. And just, educate everybody around you because that's the key here to making sure that misinformation doesn't stand.
All right, thank you, and I'd like to thank everybody who came in. We got some excellent questions from the audience this time. I'd like to thank Max Ringelheim from Vonvo for his assistance as always. This is a really great platform. There are a lot of other nonprofit groups that have discussions hosted here, so you may want to check out their Facebook page as well. And as I said, next week we will be discussing BDS in academia. The one thing that I would add, just to reiterate what Roz had said, and I think this is an argument that, especially in certain areas of the country, like ours here in the Bay Area and in Seattle, that you can use very, very effectively, because you can stand up and say to the BDS movement, the government of Israel and the government of the United States has a policy of supporting a peace between Israel as the state of the Jewish people and a future Arab state of Palestine. That's what the talks were about that the Palestinians said no to in 2000. That's what the talks were about that the Palestinians said no to in 2008. That's what the talks are that the Palestinians have thus far said no to that are currently going on. That's the discussion. We are standing in support of the policy of the government of Israel. And if you ask the BDS movement, do you support peace between a Jewish state of Israel and a future Arab state of Palestine? They will be forced to answer no. And that is one of the ways that you can unmask their true agenda. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. We will be back here in 1 week, same time, same place. Thanks for participating, and I hope to see many of you back then. Thanks to Barbara, thanks to Roz, and thanks to Rob for participating and taking your time out of your weekend as well.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.